that my muscles can use during some kind of an activity. Okay. So, disagree? Disagree? Do you think Ellis would understand that? What do you mean by air? Like the maximum amount of air that we can use. How am I using air in my muscles? I agree that you're right. Right? But like, how? What? Explain that. What are these red blood cells? My blood. I have air in my blood? That's extremely dangerous. Just like as an actual medical condition, really dangerous. I have air bubbles in my blood.
You have hemoglobin in your, it's a protein in your blood that binds to oxygen.
Okay. So I breathe the air and it gets in my blood and then it goes to my muscles. Okay. And y'all are okay with this. This makes sense to y'all.
For a 5-year-old.
For a 5-year-old, okay. She's very bright, right? She told me this morning, we went to the women's soccer game yesterday because we needed to see the one of the two Arkansas teams that's actually good at something, who struggled yesterday. We went, and then she was big, do all the Arkansas cheers, which got us a lot of not great looks. But then she loves Boomer, or I don't know which one of them. One of the horses was there, dressed up, the mascots. She told me this morning, Dad, did you know that that's a person in a costume?
Why?
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to break anybody's thing. And she's like, do you know how you know? She's like, horses can't walk on 2 legs.
Whoa.
And I was like, this is the most broken thing. And I was like, okay. I was like, why didn't she's like, but I knew this several years ago the last time that we saw Boomer. But she loves Boomer. Then we were leaving, and the mascot was in the car next to us. And it's waving at us. And she was like, Boomer's in a car. Anyway, so she's pretty smart. She kind of really boils things down to that can't be a real horse dressed up in a horse costume, right? Because horses can't walk on 2 legs, so it has to be a person. Anyway, and they were wearing a fake shirt. I'm like, well, it's a real shirt, but it's like a costume shirt. Anyway, she's very smart. She kills me sometimes. So that was why I was like, okay, can we explain air in our blood to our muscles? And then what happens? So you get the air that has the oxygen, whatever, it's the hemoglobin, all this stuff. What happens in the muscle?
Myoglobin takes it to the mitochondria.
Okay. Myoglobin takes it to the mitochondria. Some, yes. What's going on in the mitochondria? We're making ATP. We're 14 steps separated from those two things, right? But we're using air in my muscles to do what? What are we making? Joey, what are we making? Energy, ATP. Okay. And so that's the maximum amount that we can do. What do you guys think governs what that maximum is? Now I'm asking you to think critically, right?
How much more?
My lungs can expand. Okay. Lung size. Look around. Again, today it's fine. Be creepy. Look around. Who's got the biggest lungs? It doesn't matter. Okay. Colin, what did you say? And we're on this myoglobin. We have just a tiny amount of myoglobin in our bodies. It's a tiny, tiny amount. So little that we don't even talk about it. It is important. Okay. What class are you in that y'all are talking about myoglobin right now? Or was that an MCAT question? What's the role of my? Okay, it's okay. Myoglobin is important. Things would not work right if we don't have myoglobin, but it's okay. Matt.
The number of mitochondria.
Number of mitochondria. How does the number of mitochondria determine how much air I can use? He's right, but how? right? It makes sense. Who's got bigger lungs, right? More air in, right? That part makes sense. What the hell does the mitochondria have to do with things? Nathan? I will bring all of this back to what we're talking about today. I promise. I promise, right? But Nathan?
The rate of aerobic respiration.
The rate of aerobic respiration. So now it's not just the amount that I have, it's how fast it goes. I'm very confused. Again, not wrong. Does the amount determine the rate? Yes. Also, strange concept. Okay, for the three of y'all that have had biochemistry, it's just enzyme kinetics, right? If you have more, it goes faster. Still blows my mind 30 years later. Okay. But again, the amount of mitochondria determines how much air I'm using. So are we using the air in the mitochondria?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course we are, right? What is the last thing that happens in the electron transport chain?
Oxygen bonds.
Okay. Then we make water. If we don't have enough oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain, what happens? Nothing. The whole kit and caboodle gets shut down. And if the electron transport chain gets shut down, for your test questions, what happens to the Krebs cycle? Why?
It doesn't go without.
You have too many end products.
Too many end products? Bingo, Maria's got it. There's no NAD. And if the Krebs cycle gets shut down, what happens to what I can do with pyruvate? I make lactic acid. And if I make too much lactic acid, what happens? Fatigue. Hydrogen fucks everything up. Okay? That's an official scientific thing. It really is. Okay? So, again, air I breathe in the mitochondria can potentially determine everything else. That's why. Okay? Do you think it matters who has the biggest lungs? Nathan says no. No? I don't think it matters. If I said pick out the person in class that has what you think is the largest VO2 max, would you be looking around me like that person's got a big set of lungs? I'm looking for that. Maybe you should be. Joey?
Would it be the person who looks like they run a marathon?
I don't know what that looks like.
Somebody who's super lean, really lean body mass, and looks like they're very active.
Okay. I don't know what does that have to do with their lungs.
Well,
You're saying look for that, not who has the biggest lungs? Do you guys know what determines how big your lungs are? Genetics, and they're just proportional to body size. Anybody in here have emphysema? Anybody have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease? Anybody have cystic fibrosis? So we'll do the only one most of y'all might have. Anybody have asthma? All right, well, like the three of y'all that might have asthma, y'all are out. The rest of y'all, your lungs don't matter. They don't matter. Doesn't matter how big they are. They always work, right? Doesn't matter. I can have you breathe air that has more oxygen in it, and your lung capacity goes up, like your max ventilation. Anyway, we'll do this a little bit later, okay? But that doesn't matter. There are a lot of things. Mitochondria matter. Cardiovascular system matters. Okay. So we've done all of this. Make sure your names and things are on. I'm gonna take that up. We've done all of this to try to set the stage for. We need to now take the stuff that we did with metabolism. Okay. That I'm sure some of y'all brain dumped after last Wednesday. And actually put it into practice for some type of exercise. And that can be submaximal exercise, just walking or just like sitting there right now, or what happens during very, very maximal types of exercise. Okay, so I'm going to start this with a very simple thing. We cannot, that's not 100. No. Under most circumstances, we cannot easily measure anaerobic metabolism. Okay. And so all the stuff we're going to talk about today, every bit of it is about aerobic. Why is it about aerobic metabolism? Because that's what we can measure. Okay. So if you ask me, well, I'm sitting here, Dr. Black, how much creatine phosphate am I using? I'm like, I don't know. We could put you in an MRI and we could try to measure it. It's not a lot. We could try to measure it. If you say, how much lactic acid am I making? I'm like, well, we can try to measure it, but it's kind of a surrogate. It's not that easy. But if you want to say, how much aerobic metabolism am I doing? That we can do super duper easy. And so that's why today and Wednesday, we're going to focus on aerobic metabolism at rest, aerobic metabolism during like walking, jogging, submaximal exercise like events, and aerobic metabolism at max, because we can't do anything to easily measure anaerobic. Okay, so we're not ignoring it on purpose. We're just ignoring it because it's really hard. Okay, it's really hard. Okay, so to start everything, okay, we're going to talk about, is this really the first slide? No. Okay. We're going to talk about how we measure energy expenditure. Okay. In order to understand what it is that we know and how we know it and what is happening as you guys are sitting there now, are you using carbs? Are you using fat? Who's got the highest VO2 max? Before we do all of that, we have to understand how we measure energy expenditure, because that is what VO2 max, that is what any sort of stuff that happens during submaximal exercise is it's a measure of ATP derived from the mitochondria in aerobic metabolism. The single best way to do this is through something called direct calorimetry. Okay. It was a little colder outside. Today, it's like our first kind of marginally trying to think about being fall day. But I could ask you guys to get up and do some jumping jacks and then like put your hand like near your neighbor, but not touch them, right? You could feel coming off of them heat. Okay, heat. The single most accurate way to quantify metabolism and energy expenditure is to measure heat production. This is called direct calorimetry. When we make ATP, right, we're going to call that calorimetry. We're burning calories. We're making all of this. About 60% of the energy that you make is lost as heat. We're wildly inefficient. Okay. So we measure your heat production, we estimate energy use. The problem with doing this is this is also very, very, very expensive and very infeasible. We put you in a calorimeter, so it's this insulated airtight chamber. In the walls, there's copper tubing, it has water running through it. And then we measure the extent to which your body gives off heat and raises the temperature of the water in that tubing. Okay. So you got to put you in there. It's slow. We're gonna let you like live in this little room for a couple of days, where we can have you do a bout of exercise, but it's not great for kind of really quick changes in the midst of this. And this chamber is quite expensive. Okay. Very, very accurate, very expensive, very time consuming. Somewhere in Germany or Switzerland, they have a mock-up of one of these. It's an exact replica of the International Space Station. And they will put people, they can't simulate the weightlessness, but they'll put people in there if they want to go up there and like make you stay in there for like 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever, to make sure you're not going to like freak the hell out when you are up in space in the space station and you're stuck there for a year, which I think is probably a good thing. Okay. So there is not one of these, as far as I'm aware, in the state of Oklahoma. I think there's one at UT Southwestern in Dallas. I know there's one at the Arkansas Medical School in Little Rock. And so they're very, very expensive, and they're not kind of very ecologically valid. Like, can you imagine, like, we're just going to put you in a room and you got to stay in there for like 2 weeks and it's like a living in a studio apartment or something. We're like, there's a treadmill, so get up and exercise every day, do your normal stuff and all of that. It's a very kind of strange existence. Okay. So it kind of looks like this, and shows all of those things. Okay. So because that's so infeasible and strange, the way that we normally measure stuff, okay, and some of you guys have done this or seen this at the very least. If you haven't, you will in the class at some point, is something called indirect calorimetry. So we're going to measure a byproduct of metabolism. We're going to measure carbon dioxide. And from the amount of carbon dioxide that you are producing, okay, and breathing out, we're going to backwards calculate about how much aerobic metabolism you're doing. Because we understand, right, that for every molecule of glucose, for every molecule of fat, you're going to give off a certain amount of CO2 as it gets passed through. Okay, so we know that metabolism uses oxygen. We know that it produces CO2. If we assume that these two things are exchanged at the lungs in a way that is efficient and normal, which again, for those of you, as long as you have normal pulmonary function, this is going to be true, right? And that what is at the lungs or in the air reflects what's happening in the muscle tissue, then we can try to estimate energy expenditure. Okay. And so that's what oxygen consumption really is. Okay. We call it oxygen consumption, oxygen uptake. We abbreviate it as VO2. It's the volume of oxygen consumed or used by muscle and other tissues in aerobic metabolism. As you guys sit here now, you are bringing in oxygen from the air. You're using it as the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. You're making ATP. As a consequence of all of that, you're making CO2 as well. You breathe out the CO2. We measure the change in CO2 from room air to what you breathe out. We measure the change in oxygen from room air to what you breathe out. And we do some calculations and we make an assumption about how much you're actually doing. Okay. So we need to know VO2. We also need to know VCO2, which is the volume of carbon dioxide that you're going to expire out. So normally the way that we measure metabolic rates and all of these things is we're going to gather or collect the air that you breathe out. And we are going to estimate in the air that you breathe out, what's the CO2 concentration, what's the O2 concentration. And then compare that to regular room air and then do some calculation. Okay. I know you guys have seen all of this before. I just want to reiterate what this is. I apologize, but I just find this picture to be somewhat hilarious because it's from like the 1980s or something. But we're not much farther along from whatever this is. What you guys can see in here are these old O2 and CO2 analyzers. We essentially began doing this technique in the 1920s. Okay, in the 1920s at Harvard, in the business school of all things, in the Harvard fatigue lab, which is kind of a wild thing to me. But what you can see is this guy is on a treadmill. We could do this at rest, but we have a tube that comes in. It's going to bring in room air. A tube that comes out where we are collecting the air that you're breathing out. You run those two things through these fancy analyzers. You have the person walk on the treadmill or jog or sprint or whatever. And we measure the volume of air and then the concentrations of O2 and CO2 in the air. And from that, we can try to estimate what's going on in your mitochondria. Okay. How many of you guys have seen this or done this? A few of you, right? If you've had exercise physiology lab or you've had testing a prescription, you guys should have seen something like all of this. If you haven't, just come down to the lab. We'll be happy to test you. Okay. So if that's how we're going to measure things, now let's talk about sort of how we expend energy. And we're going to start off by talking about y'all are just sitting there. Okay. You're doing nothing. We're going to work our way then into submaximal exercise and then into maximal exercise. So I want to introduce or kind of reiterate a couple of concepts you guys should have had already. So the first one is something called RMR, or resting metabolic rate. This is, you guys are sitting there right now. Some of you are more active than others. Some of you spent too much time out, I think, in Dallas, it looks like a little bit, but resting metabolic rate is the rate at which we expend energy at rest. Okay. Aerobic metabolism when you're just sitting there. Okay. That's what resting metabolic rate is. There is a sort of separate condition of resting metabolic rate, if you want to call it that, called basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate is the minimum amount of energy expenditure required for you to stay alive. Okay? Think you are in a coma, basically. And the only thing that you're doing is the body is just simply running, maintaining brain, cardiovascular, pulmonary, like the minimum amount of function. Okay? It is nearly impossible for us to measure basal metabolic rate. Okay? I would have to put you guys into a coma. We'd have to do these things. Y'all don't want to sign up for that. Okay? Resting metabolic rate is basal rate plus the somewhat additional stuff from very minimal physical activity, from very minimal, like I'm awake and I'm moving and I'm doing some of those. So basal's the lowest, okay? Resting's going to be a little bit higher than all of that. We then also can have a separate concept that's going to be resting rate plus whatever you're burning just from your kind of normal movement around. You're not exercising, you're not doing stuff, but you're kind of up. Okay. If you read textbooks, it will say that most of you guys have a daily energy use if you didn't exercise, right, or you weren't particularly physically active, between 1,800 and 3,000 calories per day. I think those numbers are way too high. I think those numbers are way, way too high. Okay. Now, for a lot of you guys, that may be true because you're up, you're walking, your classes are all over campus, and you're doing some of those things. But in most of you, resting metabolic rate is going to be related primarily to one thing. You guys remember what that is? The one thing that determines resting metabolic rate above all else. Look around the room again. Who do you think has the highest resting metabolic rate? Who's using the most energy just sitting there? Isn't it? Okay, maybe body mass. You're probably right, but you're not 100% right. It's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Muscle mass.
Muscle mass. Resting metabolic rate is determined by muscle mass. So most people that have the largest body mass also tend to have the largest muscle mass. Okay. So I think these numbers are too high, right? If most of you guys just sat around all day and did nothing, some of you will just say some of our more petite folks in class, probably 800 or 900 calories in a day. Okay. So even some of our sort of more muscular folks in class, it's hard, right? If you just sit around and do stuff to expend more than 2,000 calories in a day, like it's whatever the recommended sort of daily caloric intake at 2,000 is just a lie, right? All of that stuff is weird. Okay, Joe, you had a question.
So for the BMR, some people say you calculate it for like biological units. Why, like, because that's how we do it at work. We have an in-body scale at Crunch that which basically takes you around and gives you your BMR. I don't think it's very accurate. But
It is not very accurate. It's giving you an estimated resting metabolic rate based upon what it is guessing your percent body composition is and your muscle mass on all of that. Now, maybe they have some calculation where they're going to say, okay, we assume that basal rate is 20%, fine resting rate, and then knock 20% off of that or something. I mean, I'm sure they have some, sort of thought process in that. But giving anybody their basal rate is of no use to anybody, right? Like nobody's going to be in a coma or anything like that. And so that's kind of what I would say. the in-body's not bad, but of all the ways that we measure body composition, bioelectrical impedance is the worst of those and the most prone to inaccuracies. It's not bad for people that are like me, that are like in the middle, that are average, right? It's not good for people that are more obese. It's really not good for people that are more lean. And so it's not great, but it's, better than nothing. So you will use it at Crunch to sell people things, right? And that's okay. Business, people got to eat. Okay. Things that determine resting rate, fat-free mass, more muscle, more energy use, right? Where are the mitochondria? They're in your muscles. Okay. They're in your muscles. If you have more muscle, you got to get more blood there. Okay. So the heart has to work a little bit harder, or your heart tends to be a little bit bigger in those things. Body surface area plays a little bit of a role. It takes energy to dissipate heat. The more body surface area you have, the more energy required to remove heat. We'll do a thing about heat illness and stuff towards the end of class. People that are very prone to getting heat illness tend to be individuals that have a sort of smaller body surface area to weight ratio. So they tend to be, right, like offensive linemen, and like people in football is a whole separate thing because of the pads and stuff creates things, but it tends to be people that are very large, that are very muscular, because our body surface area doesn't change in proportion to our body mass as much as we would like. And so they become a little bit worse at being able to dissipate heat. Body temperature matters, stress matters, hormones matter. Okay. When you're cold, your metabolic rate goes up. Why? Because you're going to shiver, you're going to try to give off more heat to warm yourself up. Stress matters, not that much, but a little bit. Stress is going to matter, right? Epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol are hella drugs in that particular way. Hormones matter. You're taking them or those other sorts of things. The big issue when we think about all of this, primarily the kind of easiest example for you guys would be like sort of women at various points in your menstrual cycle and all of those things. It's easier now. You can measure things. They make little strips to measure when women are ovulating and those things to try to figure out where you are. But the traditional way of doing that was to measure body temperature, to measure core body temperature. We did a study that I was a part of a few years ago, and we gave all the female participants a thermometer and made them measure their core body temperature. To do that, it rises right before ovulation because of changes in hormones and those things. Body temp goes up, metabolic rate goes up, and all of those things. These are not things that we probably need to make any of the ladies in class at all aware of in the midst of those things. But just when we say hormones, right? But then also hormones may change with age, with menopause, with andropause. We're going to have some effect on muscle mass, and it has an effect on basal metabolic rate. Okay. That stuff at rest. Okay. That stuff at rest. You rode in a car yesterday, you got home, you sat around, you did nothing as you attempted to assuage your grief from us getting our butt kicked by Texas, right? If that's what's happening. Okay. Now let's talk about what happens during a bout of exercise. Okay. Would anybody like to volunteer and be our guinea pig for the moment? And Libby wants to volunteer somebody next to her that is not her. So in those ways, anybody? Can I get anybody want to volunteer? Anyone? Bueller? No. Do y'all even get that joke? Have y'all seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Yes. Okay. Okay. I mean, that was probably when I was little. So I mean, it's way old for you guys. In those things. Okay. This is the part that I think is going to be a little bit tricky for you guys. And I want to make sure that we get it right here when we start with everything. Okay. So I'll try to draw this out. It would be helpful if somebody would do some jumping jacks, but that's okay. It's Monday. I won't make anybody do it. Right. So if we were to do a graph, okay, and on the y-axis is energy expenditure, right? You can look at that. We could call it oxygen consumption. That's VO2, not CO2, written sort of slanty. Okay. If this is 0, okay, and here is rest. If you did nothing, it would just be here. Okay. So we're never really at zero. We're always doing something. When you go from resting to stand up and walk, okay, your body weighs a certain amount. Gravity exerts a certain acceleration on us. Therefore, we need a certain amount of force to be able to walk, right? We can all agree on all of that, right? Again, stuff we talked about till we were blue in the face for like a month, okay? So what happens is when you transition from rest to exercise, there is this immediate vertical increase in the need for energy, in the need for ATP, okay? So I go from standing and I'm here. I start walking. As long as that speed is constant, my energy demand immediately jumps up like this, okay? And if as long as I don't change how much I weigh, as long as gravity doesn't change, those things seem unlikely in the next like 10 minutes, okay? And I walk at the same pace, what I need from an energy perspective is going to stay exactly flat like this. Okay? You guys with me so far? Okay? You guys are with me so far? All right. This, then I get to a place, I'm walking, stop. What happens to the amount of energy I need once I stop? It goes right back down to rest. Okay? Okay? That's what we've drawn here. It looks like this. That could be walking. If you're jogging, right, rather than here, it might be up and it might look like this. If we're jogging, okay, if I'm jogging very fast, it would be even bigger. But that's what's happening, okay? During exercise, remember, we cannot measure anaerobic contribution. But we talked about all of this, again, for a couple of weeks. We're all underwhelmed by the metabolism questions on the test. Were they too straightforward for all of the complicated shit that we talked about? I tried to make them easy. And we're like, no, they were not easy, Dr. Clark. Okay. Nobody knows, nobody cares. Y'all are really working your way towards some squats with our not being very perky and participatory today. So we can make this happen for everyone very soon if we would like.
Sir, I just genuinely don't remember a lot of questions.
We've brain dumped. Okay, that's okay. Not a worry, Matt. Not a worry. All right, so remember, at the start of exercise, I'm here, step, step. Where am I getting my energy from? Step, step. Those first couple. Where's the energy coming from? Creatine phosphate. Okay, good. Step, step, step. It's been 20 seconds. Now where's it coming from? Or so from glycolysis. What's happening to aerobic metabolism as I'm doing that? It's at something at rest, step, step. I'm using creatine phosphate. But what is happening to aerobic metabolism as I begin to move? Up, down, same. Joey says up. Anybody else? Show of hands. Who thinks up? Who thinks down? I know nobody's down. Who thinks same? And there's like a quarter of y'all that are like, fuck off. I'm not answering questions today. Okay, it's fine. That's fine. Okay. If we look at what happens to aerobic metabolism during exercise, remember, we can't measure anaerobic. So I start walking, we can't really measure the contribution of creatine phosphate. We can't really measure the contribution of glycolysis. Okay. So I'm going to try this blue one will work better. Nope, it will be worse. Okay. I have aerobic metabolism that's doing this, supplying most of my energy at rest. As I start walking, it's going to look like this. Okay. It's going to look like this. It starts to increase, but at the beginning of exercise, right, we know that aerobic metabolism is slow. And so there's going to be this lag in this rise up in aerobic metabolism. We know with walking that once we get a couple of minutes in, that we can supply all the ATP we need to walk from aerobic metabolism, but there's this lag at the very, very beginning. Okay. And so this pattern right here is the response of aerobic metabolism to all sorts of exercise, to all physical activity, walking, jogging, doing push-ups, doing squats, whatever it is, it's going to look like this. Okay. So my question is, what is going on? Again, I need a different thing, but what is going on in this green shaded area right here? Energy demand is up. It's not being supplied by aerobic metabolism, yet you can still walk. You could still jog. You could still ride your bike. Where is it coming from? Maybe. But where's this coming from? Step anaerobic metabolism. Okay. This gap, okay, here in green has to be made up for by anaerobic metabolism. We don't know if it's creatine phosphate. We don't know if it's myokinase. We don't know to what extent it's coming from pyruvate going to lactic acid, but we know that it's being supplied. This, okay, that's about the easiest way for us to try to estimate anaerobic metabolic contribution to things that we can do. Okay? So we'll talk about what this is, what we call this in just a second, but let me give you a little bit here. Okay? Remember, energy during exercise, energy use is proportional to work rate. Work is force multiplied by distance. The force you need to cover a distance depends upon gravity and how much you weigh, as well as how fast you want to traverse that particular distance. Okay? We got to keep this in. So work rate is proportional to how much muscle is being used to generate force. More force, more muscle to make a muscle contract, to make it generate force, to get it to relax and generate force again. That's where we're using all of this ATP. Okay, that's where we're using this. So when I walk, I need a certain amount of force. When I jog, I need more force. Okay, that's where all of this is coming from. Okay, VO2 increases during exercise. Energy use during exercise in a fairly linear manner with an increase in work rate. Okay, I'll show you guys what that looks like if we're only looking at walk to jog to run, okay, in the midst of those things. We'll look at that that we'll do that on Wednesday. What we've drawn here, though, is what happens during what we call submaximal exercise. So something that's not an all-out sprint. It's not as hard as you can possibly work. Okay. We are going to walk, and after a couple of minutes, oxygen consumption goes up, aerobic metabolism goes up, and it levels off. When it levels off, if you continue walking at that pace, it will not change. We call that reaching a steady state. Okay. VO2 or energy use will reach a steady state. So if you graph it, if we're measuring it, it will be flat. Okay. That's not always going to be the case. At some exercise intensities, the work is high enough, okay, that aerobic metabolism can continue to have to try to increase and creep its way up over time in order to try to maintain that amount of work rate. At higher work rates, that's difficult to do. We call that, I'll show you a graph. There's a thing called the slow component rise. So most of you guys, when you go for a walk, if you give it a couple of minutes, your aerobic metabolism is gonna level off and do things. If you're jogging pretty slowly, the same kind of thing, it's gonna level off. If you jog relatively quickly, depending upon how well trained you are, it's gonna creep up and up and up and up as we're going along, which is why at those intensities or those kind of work rates, you cannot maintain that work rate for a very, very long time, because VO2 creeps up and it creeps up, and eventually it's gonna kind of peak out and you're gonna fatigue. Okay. We'll get into a little bit of kind of what's going on in the midst of all of that. Okay. So we did this, really kind of covered some of this last time, but it's just a reminder, okay? In events lasting longer than 45 seconds, okay, we're going to use all of our systems. We are a minute in at about 70% anaerobic, 30% aerobic. So if this is a minute, we're about right here, okay? Right, most of this is anaerobic, and we've got a little bit of aerobic. As we go longer and longer, that's 1 minute. Here we're at 2 minutes. We're now at about 50-50. We're going to get out here longer. It will eventually plateau off. Okay. Okay. No. Okay. We'll stop here. It will take me longer than 2 minutes to explain kind of, this is the other concept. Okay. All right. Turn your assignment in, please. Please look and remember, there's a couple of, there's a connect assignment. There's a reading assignment that's due on Wednesday. All right. Thanks, guys.